Hi, welcome everyone. This is June the 23rd, 2019, and this is our Genie seminar. We are having a little technical difficulty with sound, but we're managing through the telephone sound, and we are recording. So we'll get started, and we start always with the reminder that we're being recorded and you're giving permission to make this a public recording so that whatever you say, realize that other people may be wanting to listen in the future, and so you're giving us permission to do that. So at the last meeting, one of the comments was that I tend to do a lot of talking, and a couple people at least thought that maybe there's need more time for me to stop. And my only defense there, I guess, is that it seems that we have two ears and one mouth to listen. So before we
no,
can
you don't
talk,
listen with your mouth.
But we listen with our two ears, and sometimes the story we tell, we need to get the basic stories before we can best respond. And there are a couple stories that I think we need to learn yet to make the best responses, but I think we're getting there. We've told a number of stories that we've had, and you're familiar with them. I try not to repeat them, only by name. But the main story that we need to understand is the story of us, the story of evolution, who we are, where we've come from, because at least the conclusion that I have is that when we understand an accurate history, the accurate history of where we have come from to where we are now, and that's going back 3.5 billion years at least. Something happened before the first life on Earth 3.5 billion years ago. We know there were trillions of constellations and other things long before that. But life on Earth, we think, started now. The new story is 3.5 billion years ago. And if we understand our trajectory from then to now, we have the ability to make an accurate projection to the future. So the wonderful thing, or the new news is that if we really understand evolution, and this is a recent understanding, Darwin only discovered evolution about 150 years ago, and for the most part, the world has rejected it. People were punished for even teaching it, and most of the world is still unfamiliar with it. But the wonderful news is that if we understand our trajectory from the past to the present, we have the ability to accurately predict the future. And what we understand from this, and this is the topic for today, Ben, I think it's the most important topic we've ever had, really, the most important breakthrough from my point of view, is if we understand that our history was that for 3.5 billion years, we had no stories. Language and symbols were not really developed, sophisticated symbols, until about 50,000 years ago. So it's like a blink of an eye, the short time that we've used symbols. And for the past 3.5 billion years, our history has been defined by scarcity, by having large numbers and not enough food, not enough resources, where our history is a history of competition, of confrontations, of wars. So war has been the normal behavior, and we know that usually what happens through habit becomes tradition, and then traditions gets transferred into DNA or passed on through genes. So the message I'd start with today is that let's understand that we inherit a museum. Our animal brain is a museum of all the behaviors that worked in the past. But today, when we're not just killing with sticks and stones and teeth and muscles and bombs that kill a few people, that we have suddenly the ability to destroy everything because of Einstein's wonderful awareness that we've created. We can create weapons with mass destruction, but we can use our energy constructively as well as destructively. So the key then today is that I'd like to convey is that when we invented symbols, the symbols we invented were tribal symbols. That is, we invented words that satisfied our old brain. It satisfied our need to go to war and to be competitive. And so our symbols were patriotic words, they're religious words, they're political words, they're words that are blaming words, the words we've learned in our early 7 words and word switches and so on. And Einstein's message is we are addicted to these words and we are not aware of it. So the message today is that we can create a new language, new words, and you've been received these words. I've all sent you about 4 or 5 pages of new vocabularies that includes the 7 word switches, but a number of other word switches. So the message I'm offering you today is that, well, that at least it's my assumption, and please, you have your point of view, you can disagree, that we are basically addicted to the language that we use, which requires us to process information into either or categories, us or them, good or bad, right or wrong. And that's why our tribes are defined by a series of confrontations and wars, and will continue to do so. That was Einstein's message. Unless we teach ourselves to use a new vocabulary of words, starting with the 7 word switches. And this is relatively new. I don't know of anyone who's done this. And I think this is what I see as what our creative use of energy, that if we can create a new language, the word switches that enable us to think in terms of both and, us and them. And we talked about this one sentence, a simple sentence. We could just change the way we think to what's good for my tribe and your tribe for now and the future. That in itself, if we could do that, would change this beam that's dominated our civilization for so long, which is what's good for me and my family and my tribe for here and now. So that's my introduction and my statement. And now I will allow you to rebut that. You have other ideas. I know people may not agree with those ideas. You have other assumptions, but it's through our meeting like this that we share our genius, that let's see if we can come up with better solutions than the ones that we've had, which is that we solve problems by physical confrontation. And as long as we do that, it's only a matter of time before, as Einstein tells us, someone will push the button and we'll have about a few minutes warning, and that'll be the end of everything.
We are going at mute.
I think one of the things that I find I do more is this business of either or, where I put myself in a position of saying, well, I've got to do either this or that, or make a decision. And most times you really don't. You know, it can be a both and it's really getting out of the habit of locking yourself into one position or the other. I think it's something in discussions you can bring up with other people when you're discussing solutions to problems. You don't have to pick, you know, you can compromise. And compromise is really the key to an awful lot of things when you're trying to solve problems of war and peace, and whether to buy the blue shirt or the white shirt and get a light blue or something like that.
And Marilyn, I think there's a word switch that goes along with that. It's called Trinity Vision. Rather than seeing the dualistic nature of things, seeing this and that, you're seeing it with the third eye, the middle ground.
Yeah.
I think one of the challenges I have with some of this is just really trying to understand, you know, I understand the either or, you know, the both and either or, but it's hard for me to apply it to actual, you know, in actual life. I'm not, you know, I hear the abstraction of it, but I'm not really sure I understand or see how it applies to how I live or how other people live around me. You know, I guess I don't really see that everybody sees things in, you know, either or. You know, I think a lot of people do see some gray areas in things. So I'm not sure that when you say that there is some word switch or word switches that would make a significant difference, I guess I'm sort of a concrete fella in this. Say I'm not exactly sure what it is that we're so concrete about, or what it is that, you know, that if we think about it in one way and not the other way, that's a mistake, or that, you know, that is the error. I guess I don't see the addiction. So that's what I think might be worthwhile to talk a little bit about. What are some examples of when there is this addiction? You know, what is if you see a junkie, you know, you see a guy say, well, you know, I have to shoot this needle in me or I won't be okay. And that's something you can kind of concretely see. I'm not sure that I'm seeing the things in everyday life that really are representative of this. You know, I have to see it one way or the other, and there's an alternative. I'm not sure that I see the addiction. I'm still one of those guys who I guess have already drunken from the well and can't really see that I'm drinking poison every day.
Well, I think generally in the negotiations, I know with the Board of Ed, they have negotiations with union people at all different levels, you know, for the groundskeepers and janitors and teachers and nurses and paraprofessionals. And you really have to go in knowing that it's not going to be your position that wins. You have to state what you want and then figure that you're going to start compromising and trying to understand what the other side wants. And even though you might not like it, to try to work out some sort of a deal. And sometimes in these negotiations, I hear this secondhand. I'm usually not sitting in on them. Some people are very hard-nosed and don't want to waver from their position, and others kind of come in expecting there's going to have to be a compromise. And I think the same from the employer side. And I'm not sure, it seems to me you have to live life, it's in that area anyway, of not getting exactly what you want and being able to accept that graciously. And I think that's a sort of an example of either or that doesn't work. It's got to be both and.
Yep, I think that makes sense. But that's you know, in formal negotiations that they break down.
Applying, you know, what's going on today with Iran. You know, how would you you know, depict that win-win situation, right? Because it is an and both, right? You know, so the best negotiation is the one that nobody walks away happy, right? Because they both get something, but nobody gets everything. But that's not where we're at in today's world, and how people treat each other, nor how people are actually thinking. And that's why the best, you know, if everybody thought in terms of and both, we wouldn't need this conversation, right?
Well, it's the spirit of compromise that seems to be utterly lost nowadays, because everybody has to win. And when you have a compromise, everybody walks away from the table losing something and gaining something, as opposed to winner take all, which is what we seem to be living by nowadays. And therein lies the inherent danger.
But you know, is there things though that do you have people who are willing to compromise and can't compromise, so you don't see the common ground? I mean, I think to pick the extreme issues, you know, the Palestinian and Israeli issue, that the insistence is that you don't exist, you shouldn't exist, and you know, we won't agree to something that recognizes your state to exist, you know, to be where you are. And just not being able to come with consensus on that. You know, is there a willingness to, because people are willing to compromise, that doesn't mean compromise can be found.
I think if your starting point is you don't have the right to exist, then compromise and consensus is negated and obliterated. You can't find it, and that's what we're trying to change, I guess.
You know, one compromise could be
and I know it's a utopian idea, is that United States uh, dismantles all its nuclear weapons and then says, see, I dismantled all my nuclear weapons, and that is why now I have the right to go and ask other nations whom I consider rogue to not create any more nuclear weapons. But what right does United States or India or Russia or China, Pakistan, all these countries who have a huge arsenal of nuclear weapons themselves, which they claim is for self-defense, what right do these countries have to ask other countries to not do the same?
I'm not sure which president. Was it Kennedy, where the Russians dismantled so many missiles and then the United States dismantled and there was really a reduction? Does anybody remember which deal that
Yeah.
was or which president?
I think it might have been Reagan and Gorbachev.
It was Reagan.
Reagan?
Mhm.
So, that really is something of what you're saying. I don't think anybody is going to unilaterally destroy their missiles. But at that time, there were only two real players, and something worked out. It didn't solve the problem, but now when you've got, I don't know, tens or hundreds of people that have missiles now, and I think at that time, when Russia was getting rid of some of their missiles, some of these other countries were acquiring them. But that was
where my question. Sorry, that is where my question is, Marilyn. What right do those countries who have nuclear weapons to ask others to not to create more nuclear weapons? So there is no moral authority. There is no big daddy here, right? Every country is having its own authority. Now, I cannot. So as a parent, if I pick my nose, for example, and I put it in front of my kids, and when they do it, I say, don't pick your nose. It's not a good habit. They will turn and say, Daddy, you do it. So this is what the biggest moral argument in front of Iran and North Korea is, that you have it. And I'm threatened by you. So what do? I will create it.
I think some of the argument for that is not so much that, the moral high ground of, well, since I'm doing it followed by demonstration. I think some of the thing is that, if you say somebody has it and it becomes threatening to me if you have it, then, that I want to deny it from you so I don't have to face it as a threat from you, which I think is a legitimate threat. I think that there's some sort of grounding there for that kind of analysis. And I think just the idea of saying I'm going to unilaterally, it is kind of a world full of bullies, and the bullies can become somewhat successful, and to disarm, I just unilaterally, just to show the example, the companies, the countries that have done that don't exist today. I think of Libya, that I think, Gaddafi, that's the example. We got the guy in North Korea who says, I'm not going to give him up. And he's still in existence. And we got Gaddafi in Libya says, all right, I'll go along, I'll dismantle. And, Libya is gone today.
We dismantled Gaddafi, yes.
We dismantled Gaddafi.
One point we are missing here. The real problem is not the nuclear weapons. At least for America, it started last year when, the real threat from North Korea started. Is not because of the nuclear weapon. It was because nuclear weapon is just the warhead. The real threat was when North Korea was able to successfully test its intercontinental missiles, which were able to deploy this far enough to hit some part of America. That is where the real thing is. So it's not as if anyone is innocent here. And I understand the part where you're saying international diplomacy is not done through morality, Obi. I agree. Mm-hmm. But the point is, it's simply that as long as other countries have nuclear weapons, the rogue countries, who we know for sure will use it for something wrong, will continue to do it just by saying that it's simply like when in the Second World War, or after the Second World War during communist era, when America used to say something to Russia, Russia would say, you are a country divided, even black people don't get most of the amenities that the white people get. So Russia was using that analogy, which was a very small, problem in the United States, to many of the things that, that moral example it used to take. That is why I'm saying, unless and until all countries unilaterally decide that we will, okay, if we dismantle all our nuclear weapons, your greatest threat is gone. Will you be ready to do it? Nobody is bringing that to the table. That is why it is both and. Now it is either you dismantle it or I will create problems for you. That is what it is happening now, and that is the crux of the problem.
Well, I'm not sure that's. I mean, I know that the Russian and the U.S. Limitation talks, I think, have fallen apart. I think the U.S. is withdrawing right now from the reduction talks that I guess were put in place many years ago. And I think that's because at least as reported from the U.S.'s perspective, the Russians aren't honoring it, and they haven't honored for several years. And the reasoning is that, well, look, we've talked to you about this several times. You're not honoring it, and if you continue not honoring it, we're not going to honor it. We're going to start building up again. And I think that's what's happened. That the negotiations have sort of, or this quid pro quo has sort of fallen apart because somebody's stepped out beyond, what the quid pro quo was, and now the race is starting up again. So, I think if you kind of look back and say, well, what are the dynamics that allowed it to happen in the first place? The reductions to, is there some benefit to trying to go back to that or walk back to that area or learn something from that period of time? But I think the same, if somebody decides it's in their best interest, I think from the Russian perspective, Russia, I don't think has a lot of good natural resources, and the strategy of influence is probably out of fear and out of doing things like nuclear, investing in destructive or mad kind of technologies, because I don't think they have a lot of economic policies that are all that successful. So the choices become irrelevant.
I agree.
Hold up.
I agree. This is the last point I have to make in this, because I think.
Whoa, hold on. Did you say this is the last point you're going to make, and that's it?
No, on this.
I don't believe that.
Why I'm saying is so see, you see the flip side of it, right? Like the one you gave a very good point. Russia and America, the talks broke off, and now both the countries will probably create more nuclear weapons. Now, will that resolve any problem? It's actually increasing the risk. The big hand is going to more closer towards the 12 o'clock, which Don keeps saying. So, see, if you have more nuclear weapons, you'll create the risk, and probably somebody will do a mistake and hit the button. If you don't have it, that is the only chance we have. Otherwise, increasing the nuclear weapons is just like two dogs barking at each other. Somebody will finally cut, take action. Increasing nuclear weapons is not a solution, and just saying that the other country is not doing it because it's a fight where everybody will lose. That's not a fight worth fighting at all.
I guess the fear is if you don't build up, then you're absolutely going to lose. That's if your partner gets to be more stronger than you do, and you kind of realize that, you just say, well, I just don't want to engage. At some point there is the motivation that, well, at some point they're going to become so powerful that we won't be able to stop. We won't be able to have an opportunity to stop them any further. And I guess that's the sinister, or the driver that kind of scoots people along, the zero-sum game kind of piece of it that motivates people to go ahead and continue to compete.
Well, that's what happened in World War II. Hitler kept getting stronger and stronger and kept on saying, I'm fine, I'm peaceful, don't worry. And everybody let their guard down, and World War II happened.
Mm-hmm. Well, the olive branch doesn't always work, as Chamberlain found out in that era. And it's not just the two superpowers anymore. Wasn't life simpler when it was just the two superpowers? Now we have too many renegade tin pot lunatics who have entered the game, like North Korea, and they are just an insightful component, a potentially catalytic component in the whole thing. And I think, as Don has pointed out in the past, mutually assured destruction, it's unfortunate that it works, or it's unfortunate that in many ways that it has worked, because we're still holding everything together with bubble gum and chicken wire against a complete hellish disaster, which is why we're here doing what we're doing in these meetings. But I don't know how it works with some of these lesser factions, such as Kim Jong-un and others, who are just out for trouble. That's just all there is. They're out to acquire power and flex power.
Marilyn, just to give a fact to you, during the British rule in Indian subcontinent, there were recurrent famines in India, which were compounded by severe taxes, that a high amount of taxes that the British used to take from India, and in a sense run its engine of the world dominance. And during those famines, more than 60 million people died in Indian subcontinent because the British were not having any empathy towards them during these famines. So Second World War is a very good example of where all the villains fought each other. Nobody wanted to do any major morality. Hitler, he used the dubious nature of all the countries around him to fool all of them and move ahead with his plan, where he first had deals with England, then he had deals with Russia to not attack each other, and then he broke all the deals. But all these other countries were themselves perpetrators of mass murder. It's just that they were not doing those mass murders in Europe, they were doing it in Africa and Asia. So it's just a matter of, it is very easy to blame Hitler. Of course, he needs to be blamed, but all the other countries who were fighting it were not any angels themselves. If Hitler, in fact, in my view is, if Hitler had not done what he had done, British and other European countries would have continued with this colonization of other countries. So while it was really sad for what happened to a large number of people in Europe and Americans who lost their lives, it turned out to be a great boon for people in Asia and Africa, where Britain did not have any more resources to go ahead or with its plan to colonize them and abuse them for many more years. And the fact is that as soon as Second World War ended, most of these colonies were liberated by Britain because they had no choice.
Yeah, I didn't understand all that you said, but I think it's a separate issue from the point that I was trying to make. I think I've learned from you what went on between England and India, and something I didn't realize beforehand. Certainly wasn't handled, and I'm not saying that all the other countries had clean hands, but I think the one that touched the United States was getting pulled into the Second World War, and by being more prepared, than they otherwise, and being able to help, where otherwise Hitler would have probably won the war. And I think what you're talking about is another issue, that everybody doesn't do everything right and behave the way they should.
I'm sort of, it's very interesting to talk about politics and talking about some of these, global decisions that can be made. When I am listening to that kind of change in vocabulary, I'm sort of I'm more interested in talking about how it's going to affect us and what we can do locally. I'm not quite sure how it would resolve some of these international issues. but I'm pretty sure that there's nothing that I'm going to do directly that's going to greatly influence what's going to happen on some of this international scale. But I can, influence kind of what happens around me, and if I want to set an example for others that I think might be a map or might be a beneficial way that other people might copy. The ways that something like we're talking about here might really help individuals or in a local environment or a local way. So that's where I'm still challenged a bit with what is the vocabulary we're using, not so much at the international level, but even at the local level, that's both and or either or that's demonstrates where what the addiction is that we don't see, because I'm still not quite seeing it, what that addiction is. And I'm kind of curious that it's I hear that there's a road to success in Don's thinking, but I guess I'm looking for a little bit more concrete examples on exactly what the problem is and what the word switches are supposed to address. So I guess I would invite, is there any local examples around that show how it works, which is how it would be practiced locally, that can sort of exemplify what it is we're talking about?
I think you're getting more to the point that I see is the critical when we really examine our use of words. What makes us different is the ability to use words, because words are symbols that signal emotion, that signal behavior. And when our ancestors, who were biologically programmed to look at the world in terms of us and them in two categories, that's the way our animal brain could only think. It was perfectly normal for millions of years to engage in building muscle and strength to compete for limited resources. And that's become part of our biology. So when we finally invented language, the language we invented was to teach ourselves this either way or way of thinking that you must identify with your tribe. And when you belong to your tribe, then you owe your allegiance to your tribe. Our ancestors could not survive as individuals. They had to be part of a tribe. Not only for humans, but we see that with every other species, they're complicated species. Whales travel with whales, sharks travel with sharks, wolves travel with wolves, the red ants travel with red ants, and so on. So we don't realize that we're biologically programmed, and that we've finally created words that divide us into us and them. That's why we have a history of wars. So the drug addict, the heroin addict, the person who's addicted to whatever it is, whether it's a food addict who overeats, to sex, to gambling, all of the addictions have the same characteristic, that once we get into that comfort zone, we experience comfort and pleasure, immediate pleasure. Then we don't want to give it up, because the long-term solution, what's good for now and the future, we haven't done that yet. We're still stuck in the other way of what's good for here and now. So MAD is a natural development. As long as we create more weapons, and everybody now is beginning to create, we have 9 countries that are now creating these weapons. So that is a short-term gain, but long-term pain. That's the problem. You see, our way of thinking is addicted to this kind of placebos. We do it feels good, and once we get into that comfort zone, then we're not willing to step out of the comfort zone, which is giving up. That's what's good for me and my family and my tribe. We've been doing that for so long. So these new words, you see, they enable us to change. The simple words like I allow stops the blaming, and either or is the way we've been thinking that divides us in the two categories. If we simply say both and, we realize that we're really connected. It's when we work together. So you want an example, I'll try to give you an example. This has to do, I think, with what I've been learning about quantum physics. When we create when we take something up, we move something up. It takes energy to move something up. We're creating energy for it to come down. The energy of height. When we go left, we're creating energy to go right. What we don't realize that anytime we create love for someone, we're also creating an equal amount of hate. So when for example, if I love someone, I'm creating an equal amount of hate for whoever opposes that someone. If I love you and anything that opposes you, I hate in an equal amount. So if you think about our body, we have a front and we have a back. Our back is not the opposite of our front. It's connected to the front. If you take a coin, the back of the tail of the coin is also have the same space as the head of the coin, and they're totally connected. So they're related. When we create the head of the coin, we create the tail. So what we've done, you see, we take hate and we direct it against people instead of saying we need hate. It's just as important as love, because we hate prejudice, we hate death, we hate disease, and we need to we realize that this is an either-or situation, but our tendency is to look at words and divide them into two categories. So until we can develop a new language that we start saying both and instead of either or, and I allow instead of blaming, the language we've been using for our ancestors created limits us to process information, to look for placebos or immediate gain. Once we're comfortable in a certain way, then we stop looking at the long-term solution. So that's why in the world today, the 9 countries have all created more weapons. That's our answer, more and bigger weapons. But no one has accepted the idea that until we learn to cooperate and work together, it's a matter of directing our energy for the benefit of us and them, not against them. And until we can think differently, we will stay stuck in this quandary that the heroin addict has, or the alcoholic addict that says, you don't understand. You can't take my alcohol away because I need it now. I need my heroin. So emotion is more powerful than intellect. And the first point I brought up, the very first point that I think we've overlooked, is that what's new is that when we have an accurate understanding of our trajectory from past to present, we have the ability to project into the future, and that's called prevention. When we can anticipate the future because we accurately have a history. But the history we've learned is that we still follow is this old history of there's a God up above that we have to pray to, and if we do the right thing, then we'll get rewarded.
I guess I'm looking for something that's more, more how I look at things today. It's a little too abstract for me to really follow. I mean, I have a choice. When it's towards the end of the evening, I can, watch Stephen Colbert, or I can read a book. And, I usually choose to watch TV at this point. That's just, I'm not sure that's both end or that's just being lazy, but I guess it is being lazy. And that's the kind of, the level at which I'm kind of seeing how something like this would apply when it's both end. I think most people look at things and already in a both end, everything's kind of like, I could invest my time doing this or that. And there's not an automatic, I always throw this away because it's the future and I do this because this is the present. I'm not sure how I would, if we go back to the word switches, maybe that's where these examples are actually showing up, where, I can see how this actually operates or what the addiction really is. And I guess it's maybe going back to those particular examples to kind of see how this applies. Otherwise, it just, that I don't, in practice, I'm not quite sure where the both and the either or, in my sense, everything is always there. It always is both and already, and maybe it's just a matter of calibrating it. I'm just having a hard time seeing how the language you know, we kind of got these big concepts, and we got these smaller concepts of language, and then, you know, how the two relate in a concrete manner.
Well,
And,
I think the business of he makes me or I allow, I have a little trouble with the word addiction as opposed to habit. But if you're in a frustrating situation and you say, well, he makes me crazy, and then you just sort of leave it at that, it deprives you of changing the situation if someone is making you crazy. If you do change it to I allow him to upset me, or however you're going to put it, I think it is a comfortable situation to say someone else is making me do something, that I don't have to do anything after that. It's all the other person's fault. But if you start to say, I'm not going to use that as an excuse anymore, then maybe you can start changing it. Either you can not get upset, or you can separate yourself from the person that you feel is making you crazy, or do something else. But it is empowering, and I think of it more as a bad habit than an addiction. I guess I don't see addiction in that light, but it is empowering, because then you can go and change things once you change the words.
I agree with that. I think that's a very good example. But I think recognizing that it's I'm allowing myself to become crazy and somebody's not forcing me to do it. That's, you know, that gives a better opportunity for resolution, but it does not get a resolution. I mean, I think that, you know, Israel realizes that, you know, we really, you know, we are willing to compromise on certain things, but some things we can't. Or if I'm negotiating, you know, I know I'm allowing myself to get mad because, you know, my wife is berating me or we're having a big argument. But the fact that I know I'm getting myself, allowing myself to be upset doesn't really mitigate the fact that we're still fighting. And even if I sort of, you know, recognize that that's helpful, but, you know, I still can't stop being berated. You know, even if I say, hey, I know, you know, please stop, please turn it off a bit. You know, I know I'm allowing myself, or I'll say to her, you know, it's not me who's making you upset, you're doing it yourself. And, you know, that certainly doesn't curtail the fight. And when I point, you know, even when I recognize it myself, it's like, okay, I know that this isn't being very constructive, but, you know, and I'd like to disengage or whatnot, but, you know, still the other person doesn't want to disengage, or feels that it's you know, it's an insult should I disengage. I mean, I recognize that you know, I'm doing it to myself, but I'm not quite sure how it gives me an opportunity to see a better way, but it's not it doesn't guarantee me that I'm going to get out of this to see a better way.
There ain't no guarantees.
There ain't no guarantees. So I'm saying that with recognition of all these things, I'm not sort of seeing how this changes things that, you know, the guarantee is this is actually going to lead to a global difference. Obviously, I think it's better, it's an improvement if you sort of have a better understanding of, you know, a more rational understanding of how the world operates, and, you know, kind of things that can make you happy and not make you happy. And I subscribe, or I, you know, promote all of those things. I'm just not sure that there's an automatic, you know, even realizing these things. And you say realizing there's certain addictions that I may have to patterns. You know, it helps the situation, but it certainly doesn't guarantee that other people around you are going to be changing a world and living in a way that's going to automatically make everything better.
The bottom line, though, is that, see, it's not that we talked before, we don't change others by telling them to change. We change by changing ourselves and becoming examples. So when you realize that we are addicted to blaming, we're addicted to fight or flight, that's part of our biology, then you have the ability to change your response. See, that was the key we started with earlier, that Epictetus told us it's not the events in our life that get us upset. It's our attitudes, our reaction to them, the assumptions we make about it, that we can learn that we're responsible for ourselves. Now, I think that point that Marilyn brings up is one that's very common. The message that I've tried to convey is that we're born with a biologic tendency to fight or flight. Habit has become pre-wired in us. Animals are fight or flight organisms, and we're born with an animal brain that controls our behavior. So the patterns we inherit that we're addicted to, that we're biologically programmed, are all the positive patterns that were useful in the past. Fight or flight was necessary to survive in the past. Today, it is insane. It used to be normal and sane. It's still normal because we're still pre-programmed for fight or flight. But what Einstein is telling us that what used to be normal is now insane. To have more powerful weapons and so on, when other people have powerful weapons, then it ends up in mad, short-term benefit at the price of long-term gain. So if we can recognize that the behaviors we've inherited were all the positive behaviors at one time, but now the world is changing. Evolution is the story of change. And now all of a sudden, we're not just fighting with teeth and sticks and stones anymore. When if every wolf or every tiger or every shark is not just fighting with teeth, but each of them have a nuclear weapon, the world would be over very quickly, because the weapons we use to fight with are now final. They don't offer any second chance. Our history is one where we make mistakes and then we learn from them. The message is we can't make these mistakes anymore. And we have to, I think, until we recognize, and maybe this gets to you a little bit more, Avi, what you're bringing up. How many times have you thought you realized there was something that was beneficial for you to do, but instead you did what felt good at the time? You know, when you ate that high cholesterol food, when you knew that it wasn't such a good thing for you, because our emotions are more powerful than our intellect. It's been that way. And until we can learn to be more aware, consciously aware of what we're doing. But the message is that we have an addiction, and this is true of all the addictions, that we don't want to acknowledge that behavior has become insane. No one likes to be told they're insane. And when we're told they're insane, then we get very reactive, because that is the normal way we've been programmed. To react when somebody does something we don't like. That's the addiction we have that we're not aware of. I don't know if that helps or not, but to me it seems clear. But it's very hard to find the new words when we don't have them in our language. The point is, you talk about the words. If we don't have words that clearly express ourselves in the concepts, you know, in our language we have basically one word we use for love. But the fact is that tribal love, which is loving your tribe unconditionally, is the very kind of love that leads us to have wars, because we identify with our tribe. Now, the message is, until we can develop this new way of thinking where we have more global or universal love, love your neighbor as yourself, that's a crazy idea to most people, you know. And when Jesus said, "Love your neighbor as yourself," they said, "Here's a real rebel." You know, it was a political statement. You know, the people in charge knew that when you had more weapons, that was the important thing. Jesus was a long-haired rebel, you know. He supposedly depicted with long hair, and you know, he had this crazy idea that you should love your neighbor. And that message, you know, our idea is still that day. Should we love Iran? Should we love Hitler? Should we love these other people? But maybe if we understand that maybe that they were brought up in a way, they were brought up with the same addiction that we have. What's good for me and my family and my tribe? and we
Yeah.
Josephine isn't here today, but she hit on, I think, one of the ideas that we also said as part of our evolution tells us that in history, males got muscle and they got the desire to spread seed, whereas women were given the basic task of having the offspring and nourishing them. So women got the power of love and men got the love of power. And since that time, as I said, we've been divided. Males, how we haven't disbalanced now. So in the most primitive state, we've said males will have made rules that women should have their clitoris removed and their labia sewed up, and they cover them with clothes so that they're not be seen and they can be legally murdered for not following man-made rules. That's the kind of thing that people still are.
Yeah. So where does fear come in? Because I think fear of differences of people, of differences of tribes, have played a part as to your fight or flight feelings. Really understand you, I become scared of you. Therefore, I end up, thinking, and it causes problems. And so how do you overcome that? And that's why I think that your word switches really do help in that way, because you'll have less fear and therefore less reason to fight. I'm stopping there just to get a reaction.
Yeah, John, your internet connection's kind of wailing out a little bit, so it was a little bit tough you came in chopped up with your last comments, although most of them did come through.
Okay. Did you, can you hear me now?
Yeah, it's a little better.
Okay. So fear, and if I don't know you and you're different to me right away, I have a skepticism or maybe a fear of you. And if we learn how to better speak to each other, maybe that we can allay those fears. And that's why the word switches, I think, are a good way to do that amongst people. But I think fear is part of the reason why we have what we have today in the arms races, and I fear and I don't trust and I fear you, right? So how do we make that better? So that's really just a simple thought. I think fear is part of the equation.
Yeah, I sort of see that's part of the complexity of human nature. That's part. That's one of the drivers that goes into the soup of behavior. It's probably good to recognize it as, that whatever alternatives come up with, they sort of need to incorporate all the elements of human nature as they exist, fear being one of them. I think there needs to be some sort of self-evident truth that doing it a different way is better than doing it the way you've been doing. And I think that's the trick, is if you can come up with something that demonstrates that, then I think you have a hope of having a behavioral change happen at a larger scale. It needs to be somewhat self-evident or somewhat, clear that it does improve things. If I go to work and, I always do it for the team, and there's people who are always taking credit for my work and they're getting promoted and I'm not. On one hand, it's best for the company, but on the other hand, it's not really good for me. And how many people are going to re-emphasize that behavior? That, the people who are, taking advantage of others are always getting ahead and the ones who are doing the work, are staying behind. That kind of group organization, it has a certain signature and certain things get reinforced. This is a little bit off of my sort of view, is the reason why some companies are very successful is they've figured out a way to get around that. They figured out ways that, well, if it's indeed true that when people work together, they're more productive than when they're working apart or working kind of in complete competition, those companies should do better. And I actually think they do. I think the Googles and the Amazons and the people who have sort of more, I guess, considered enlightened ways of organizing their work routines do better. They're more successful and they're reinforced by the fact that they're more productive. To me, that's
one of our word.
Oh, go ahead.
One of our word switches, remember, is we substitute for fear, anger, and anxiety energy. So our ancestors gave this emotional response that we normally have, a normal response. They gave it the word fear, anxiety, and anger, which tells us to respond or react. And a substitute word would be energy. If we realize these are healthy signals, anxiety and energy are signals telling us there's a problem and we need to direct our energy to solve that problem. But instead, we just think of it as anger, and our normal response because of the word we've used tells us to strike out because of anger. Or we have fear, it tells us to run. So those are the words that create the fight or flight response, which was perfectly healthy and normal for our ancestors. But when everybody now has weapons that kill everybody and we have mad, we need to change those words from anger and anxiety. Fighting now has become obsolete. When we're fighting not with sticks and stones, where we settle the dispute by confrontation and showing greater power, it no longer works. It's an obsolete response. So the message is we have to change our word to energy to say, what can we do to find a way to negotiate a mutual solution rather than end it by killing one another. And of course, in today's world, the answer, when we have scarcities, we have to limit our population. We can't keep creating more and more people so that we're going to have 50 trillion people eventually if we keep going, but we'll kill ourselves before then. And we know how to create enough corn and for water now that our ancestors didn't have. So the normal response was fear and anxiety was a healthy response. And that's the point that I've been trying to make, that the animal brain we inherit is a collection of the positive behaviors. I mean, the addiction that we were given are positive addictions. They're not negative addictions. We don't like the word negative addiction because it says it must be word crazy or something. But these words were at one time positive. But now that we have these nuclear weapons and we can no longer deal with things by the correct way, is no longer normal to fight and kill one another. We have to find a way to negotiate. Otherwise, we'll all be dead. Instead of being a win-lose environment, it's got to become lose-lose until we can change it to win-win. I don't know if that gives a little better example, but I hope it does.
Well, I think the fear to energy is a good example. That's something that can be kind of understood locally. That the motivation for fear, is rather than just being angry, is to actually do something.
But the example you give, if you feel that somebody such as your wife is inappropriate, and the normal response is anger, and it was at one time a perfect response. It was physically.
Yeah, I mean, when you say it was a response at one time, it's still, sometimes you can sort of say nicely, please disengage. And if they don't do it, you have to yell back in order to, make yourself understood. And it might, it's still not a great outcome, but, when somebody's got their arms around your throat and you're kind of like, it's not okay, it's not okay just to talk it out. I need to also respond with a violent attack. Um,
But your wife does not have
you know,
her arms around your throat. And she's really a loving
well,
person, so you're having a misunderstanding. But as long as we say or think that way, that's the normal way we think. We think and we get automatically angry and we want to strike out, and that's not an appropriate response anymore.
well, on the other side of it though is that if your neighbor is hurling, throwing fireworks and M80s and small pieces of dynamite over your house, at some point you can say, you shouldn't do that anymore. I'd like you to stop doing that. And, if the answer is, well, they won't do it. And then if you throw something back over, they do stop. Is it just to sort of say that, well, I'm never going to answer violence with more violence. I just not quite sure how practical that is either. Just to sort of say that, well, I'm just never going to do this one behavior that has had some demonstration of working over the years, or through common experience. It does work. And, for some people, is that the only way to go? I mean, just to argue that, well, I could just never do it, and because it's always destructive, and unfortunately, I think it isn't always destructive. Sometimes it actually does yield to an outcome that, is a truce or something that is survivable. Somebody just is, you think that something is really important and they really shouldn't do it that way, but they just don't think that way. And, in areas where there isn't, there's not compromise.
Or a re-angling of the question is, what do you do when every response under a violent response is ineffective and doesn't work? What do you do when the provocation is increased and repeated and every effort you make for a diplomatic solution fails? I know that taking action in that kind of a way, I mean, for me, I always think to myself, all right, what comes back at me now? What am I just, asking for a response that I ultimately won't be able to handle, and that much of the time will push me back to the fight or flight, and generally I would select flight in a situation like that until I'm threatened.
I would say it just slightly different. I would say, or ask it as a question, at what point is violence okay?
To protect yourself, I say, protect yourself and your loved ones, to repel an attack, not to launch one.
And
Look, if you were,
that is true. But what is considered an attack? Is someone touching your wife an attack?
An invasion of yourself or your loved ones in a damaging way, I suspect.
Yeah, I agree. But is violence okay in that at what point is it fear of just bodily harm or fear of death? Does somebody pull out a knife before you have to become violent, or is it something less
probably.
than that? That's the quandary. That's the quandary I come to.
Right.
That says, at what point is violence justified?
Well, I think when it's against property, I wouldn't respond violently. When it's against property, I would exhaust every other potential solution that is afforded me. What I'm saying is, when is violence okay? The only time I think it's okay is self-defense.
Yeah, I think you have hit the nail on its head. One of the greatest proponents of peace and non-violence is Mahatma Gandhi, and this is what he said. So somebody asked him the same question, that what if somebody attacks you? Would you still favor non-violence? And they asked him a specific example, like for somebody like Hitler, why is Gandhi supporting the Great Britain at that time in the Second World War? And he gave the same answer, that by non-violence, I don't mean that if somebody is trying to kill you, just lie down and you have to do self-defense, and that is probably the only time you can use violence, as long as the threat is over.
Until
if you were attacked by a lion, and you had a gun, the appropriate thing would be to shoot the lion, because I would think. Now, however, if there was a possibility of retraining the lion had an animal instinct. The animal is born, the only way he can live is by killing his prey. But if you had a way to, as we did with the example John brought up a while back, his two loving dogs, his two loving pets, they were once wolves, but if we taught them with love to be loving one another, now they became wonderful family supporters, important part of the family. The Dalai Lama was asked, who was a very peaceful person, he said, what do you do when a mosquito bites you? The idea of love for all. What do you do when a mosquito bites you? His response was, well, first, he says, I would make a donation. He says, what about the second time? He says, well, I would take my hand and I would brush him away. And he said, what about the third time? He said, and then he took his hand and he slapped his arm. He says, he made it pretty clear he would kill the mosquito. So it may be, you see, that when we can make a change, perhaps we can use education. But when we're dealing with a wild animal, maybe if you think of Hitler that way or whatever, then maybe the only response is that we have to have more power. But when we have a situation we've gotten to today, where when everybody has the ability to have a lose-lose situation where everyone loses, maybe we have to find a better way. I don't know if you recall the story I gave you. What if you could you imagine you were up to your neck in shit and someone vomited? Would you duck or would you do something else? And I think you had some responses, but at least my conclusion would be the appropriate answer is because you imagine it, because you can use your imagination, and it's not a real situation yet, we can engage in prevention. We can do something ahead of time to prevent being in that position. So because we can imagine, and that was Einstein's between imagination is more important than anything else, or the most important discovery maybe in history, our ability to imagine, because we can engage in storytelling in our mind, we can create stories and find and anticipate the future, that we have the ability to use prevention. Now, we had lots of evidence before World War I that was going to happen, but we didn't do anything. We had lots of evidence before World War II that we were building up to a major war. We didn't do anything, as was mentioned. Hitler told everybody that he wasn't going to attack England. So they said England, so the prime minister said, we don't have to bother with Hitler, be concerned about it because he told us he's not going to attack us. But words, you see, make people's opinions, and that's where we get ourselves into trouble. So if we have an understanding of our history, we can predict the future. Now we have a clear understanding of where we're headed in this world. All you have to do is read the paper and see what's going on. Just yesterday they said the planes were loaded and sent off to start an attack on Iran. We're so close to that end point now, and the question is, do we have a means? Do we give up? And maybe that's the answer. That's the hawks are saying. Right now, it's time to drop our bombs and let's get it over with. A first strike is appropriate, and we know what would happen. Like as soon as now, with 9 countries aware, if Russia or China thinks there's an attack going on, they have no alternative but to push your button and everybody's bombs get unreleased at one time. That's the situation we're in. And the question is, can we become aware that maybe there's a better way? Can we use our imagination to say, can we prevent this? Maybe it's too late. That's what some of the pessimists are telling us, and it may be right that the best thing to do would be to push our button and get it over with, because maybe we can win the war. And that's historically, that was the way we solved problems. And it is still, for thousands of years, has been the normal way of solving problems. But today, the best way of solving problems is by negotiation, by meeting in meetings like this, where we create where we've got to use our genius, our ability to negotiate and to think in terms of how can we use our energy constructively rather than getting back to this fight or flight response that we automatically inherit. But it's considered normal now when, as you say, when somebody's got when you feel that somebody's got their hands around your throat and they're choking you, then your only alternative is to strike out and either kill them or run away. Sorry again for my passion in getting it off. But I think there's a point here that we've been missing, and that's what I've been trying to get across, that we are asleep and we don't realize it. We are addicted, and this word is not a negative word. It's really, I mean, to be consciously aware of that we've been stuck with a language, with words that basically, with political words and words that are all tribal. Those were all healthy, normal words for thousands of years. You've got to be part of a tribe. You've got to be prepared to show allegiance to your tribe and kill for your tribe in order to survive. And that's true with the red ants and the black ants. It's true with every higher level species. We are different from every other species because we've given something between our ears that enables us to solve problems by predicting the future using words and imagination that no other living creature has. But we're not used to doing that. We're still used to fight or flight instead of conflict resolution. Can we find a way to resolve conflict where we end up with a win-win situation, changing the program? In other words, our computer has been already pre-wired, but we've been given this wonderful gift. We have this ability to use our creative intelligence to come up with solutions. And the best way we can do that is by meeting in groups like this. And there are not many people doing that. Instead, what most people are doing, instead of talking and trying to come up with solutions, we're trying to figure out how to make better weapons and make more of them so we can engage in, the 9 countries, the 9 leaders that have these weapons. That's the way they've used more weapons, and negotiations are broken down. My way is the only way, is the right way. And if you don't understand that, then I shall kill you. I'll cut your head off. There are too many people around who still say, if you don't believe the way I believe, I'll cut your head off. But as long as it's going on over the other side of the ocean, we say, forget about it. It's uncomfortable to think about these things. I'd rather spend my time figuring out how I can make money or be happy and enjoy myself when we really have a task ahead of us.
Yeah. One point. Can you guys hear me?
No, you're breaking up, John.
John, if you turn off let's see, if you turn off your picture, you might have better signal. You just talk and put
His picture is already turned on. That's the picture.
Okay, yeah.
Big picture.
Okay, so I'm sorry we're having trouble hearing you, John. Try again. You want to try again?
John went on mute.
Yeah, we're not hearing you, John. Well, anyway, we're over our meeting time. So last comment.
It's okay. It's not a problem.
Yeah, still poor
having trouble,
connection.
John.
I
Just
gotta
one
say,
last comment on what you.
one note about IBM. We got one of the biggest countries, biggest companies in the world, IBM. We got John and Josephine, and both of them have the crappiest connections of everybody here. I think it's maybe good to continue along maybe these lines, Dak. I think maybe there's certain elements of human nature that I think is worth flushing out a little bit. I just think this example, I think the idea of the tiger lunging towards you, to convince the tiger to change its nature is probably a very apropos example. of, you know, what we're up against, and, you know, somehow recognizing that that is the nature of the tiger. You're unlikely to convince him. You know, you can try, and it's maybe worth to do it, but I think that is the situation of nature. And to sort of figure out that you're just going to change nature is a pretty strong challenge.
It may be the only alternative, though, other than mutual assured destruction. Last comments. Let's see. Who hasn't spoken
Yeah.
and would like to speak?
Can you guys hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So what I was going to say before, I was at the counter, so I couldn't talk because the signal was very bad in the back of the store, and I couldn't tell you that in any way. But what the point I was going to make is that, you know, very interesting. I grew up with the people from Saudi Arabia, and the striking thing about them, people I grew up with, was that, you know, they showed me pictures of them carrying AK-47s when they were 7 years old, and the thing that struck me more than anything is that when they had no fear of killing somebody, no fear whatsoever, or not fear, or the value of life. When you grow up in a situation, in an environment where life is not valued, you grow up differently. Even when you are introduced into an area now that is much more civilized, you carry with you some of those values that you grew up with when you were, you know, very, very young. And I'm not sure how you guys feel about that. And it wasn't the fact that they were, you know, what nationality they were. It was more a fact of what how they grew up. Now, I become very good friends with them. I used to go out dancing with them. They were great people. But the fact that the way they grew up has determined, in some ways, the values that they hold of the value of life itself. Let me just get a quick comment. I know it's late to bring that one in. That one that could have a whole topic all day on. So let me just stop there and just get your quick reaction.
It's a very important point that you bring up, and we need further discussion. The whole idea of how we bring up our children, what do we teach them? But that's a wonderful point. Let's see. Anyone else who has not spoken? Pearl, did you want to say anything? Or? You have Pearl muted.
I agree with what John says. I think so much of what we learn here and so much of what we discuss after we're finished, my thoughts go to the fact that it's so important as to how you grow up and the values you grow up with, and the people who influence your thinking. And, you know, otherwise, I go back to Sharik's opening statement about if we gave up our nuclear power, as an example, others would give up theirs. Well, if we gave up our nationalism and our way of thinking, you know, we wouldn't have to worry about stockpiling nuclear warfare. But there's a lot of discussion, I think, that's yet to come about how we're raised and the thought process that goes with it. And that's all my thoughts have taken me to today.
Any other final comments? Okay, well, we're well over, and I would just, my last suggestion then would be, everybody has been sent an email with a paper that starts with urgent. It's only about 4 or 5 pages, and I will send it out again with the vocabulary with the 4 or 5 page vocabulary of word changes. You know, the 7 word switches are just the beginning of the vocabulary. And I don't think, you know, the original suggestion was that in order to learn them, you should spend 30 minutes every day for 30 days before you really learn them. If you just talk about them once a week for an hour, it's going to take a long, long time before you learn to really apply the new word switches. But we'll send off this revised urgent essay that has 4 or 5 pages of the word switches. I just urge that you take a look at them, skim them over, or read them actually, and you'll get a better idea why I think the new story of us that tells us who we are, that allows us to predict more of the future accurately and take action, appropriate action, can change this addiction that we don't know we have. Now, it's hard to, you know, if Einstein was correct, if he was correct, which I think he is, that we have a way of thinking that we inherit, which is no longer adaptable. The way we've been thinking for millions of years is not, well, we've had language for 50,000 years. The way we've been thinking is an either or way of processing information. We don't realize that there's a better way. And that's what Einstein suggests. Until we teach ourselves a different way of both and thinking, processing information, it's only a matter of time before we have human catastrophe. Those were his words. I would say species suicide. We will become the first species to create suicide deliberately. But his words were that we will just create human catastrophe. And because we're comfortable avoiding that, it's going to continue. So thank you all for sharing and for your passion and your brilliance in coming up with ideas. But I think we're getting somewhere. I think we're moving ahead here, and we're zeroing in on less blaming. We've continued to do less blaming, more constructive thinking, and I think if we keep this up, we'll come up with a solution. The one solution is that can we start Genie seminars? Can we start programs? And I just mentioned that Saturday, I will be doing an orientation for the use of these Genie seminars. So if you're available, I know you might have an interest, Katie, to come on Saturday. We'll get you the information. But that's what I'm saying. Okay? So have a good week, everybody. And we'll say goodbye. And we'll continue with our business meeting.
Okay, bye-bye all.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Finally over. Yeah.
Hey, before I drop off, Dad, and Sharat,